I'm pleased to be here. Some of you know that I have had a long-term interest in the Czechs and Slovaks going back to my first visit to Prague in December of 1968. And one of the things I've realized when I've been here is that at one time the King of Lithuania, Vytautas Magnus, was also the King of Bohemia. We're talking 1422, 1423, in case some of you need to review your history. I'm also delighted to be here because when I first came to Prague, well, it would be 45 years ago now, almost 45, I would never have imagined being able to speak at a session like this and to have this kind of wide variety of people coming together to talk. I mean, December 1968 was 4 months after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and some people thought, well, things are not going to change for a long time because efforts at change have not worked. And yet, here we are, and it's almost 25 years since things have really changed. In an article reviewing the last 25 years of the Lithuanian media, Leonidas Donskis remembers what being a professional meant in the days of Soviet rule in Lithuania. A happy combination of dedication, courage, and passion made it possible in the late 1980s and early 1990s to reform and refurbish the entire public domain of Lithuania, he wrote. There was no secret in this. Old Soviet professionalism, deeply embedded in the abyss between specialized writing and political engagement, retreated, thus allowing new ways of thinking and writing to step in. At first glance, that would seem to be a condemnation of Soviet professionalism because it did not allow for the free and open publication of facts and the expression of opinions. In fact, it suggests to me that the best journalists use that space, that abyss, in a professional way to advance the interests of their readers. And that's the thesis of this paper, that to understand the best work that journalists do in different times and places, especially in East Central Europe, we must understand the best journalism as the art of the possible. This argument does not deny that police and security organs could be and can be repressive and have severely limited the range of the possible at times. But it does argue that the best journalists push those limits and continue to push those limits when they can. Whoops, we've gone too far here. Let's see if we can go back. Okay. So what I want to do is to talk about the art of the possible, to try to define the crucial elements of the way I see professionalism, talk a little bit about the experience in the US with the development of professionalism, and then break down what's happening in East Central Europe over these various periods. The last one here is post-communism, because I'm trying to figure out when post-communism ends. And I'm thinking maybe 25 years, we're almost at a generation. We've had various ways of doing things that have drawn up from the historical experience, so maybe it is time to move on. Although the roots of the professions go back to the medieval period and perhaps as far back as the Greeks, scholars did not begin to study them until the 20th century. For it was only in the 19th century form that they began to take the form we generally recognize today. Professions were generally seen at the beginning as being independent of, but related to, both commerce and industry. They were designed to maintain freedom of action for their members on the basis of recognized and achieved qualifications. The first systematic study of the professions that offered a historical and theoretical background that showed professions as consisting of organized bodies of trained individuals who applied expert knowledge against a background of ethics was published only in 1933. Journalists have fit somewhat awkwardly into frameworks of professionals because there has been no prescribed educational requirements and no required examination for entry into the field. Owners of news media and journalists themselves have benefited from the idea that professional journalists are independent of politics and thus purveyors of objective facts and information. And so I put together these crucial elements, and my assistant was very clever in putting together this PowerPoint. But these are the 4 areas that I'm going to talk about, and I don't necessarily do them in that order, which is why I put them all up there now. Studying journalists as professionals according to the full range of characteristics, I would argue, narrows our understanding of what journalists have accomplished in the past. Growing out of a Whiggish interpretation of history, this approach has too often led scholars to leave out the context. Rather than asking how well journalists measure up to a list of qualifications that too often we see as universal, we should be seeking to understand the roles and functions of journalists within the contexts in which they operate, how those roles and functions have changed over time, and what has caused those changes. Studying journalists as professionals has also privileged a Western understanding of modern journalism, particularly in the United States and Great Britain. As the research by Daniel Hallen and Paolo Mancini should alert us, other societies at other times, particularly those with restricted freedoms, have understood the role of journalists and journalism differently. Understanding those differences will help bring into sharper focus the broadly professional way the journalists of different times have facilitated consideration of national, societal, and political issues in the public square, no matter how limited that square might be. Since the idea of a profession of journalism began to emerge on both sides of the Atlantic around the middle of the 19th century, the journalists themselves, as well as the societies in which they have functioned, have defined in different ways what the roles and functions of journalists should be. What I want to do this afternoon is to look comparatively at the historical development of these roles and functions in different political and national and economic conditions in East Central and Eastern Europe. I'm going to be talking mostly about Hungarians, Czechs, and Poles. I may make brief reference to a couple of others, but already trying to argue for a different definition and then looking at different historical periods in different countries, we would have to have this whole conference devoted to the subject if I went into details on all of them. I want to argue that we need to think about changing our understanding of what it means to be a professional journalist. Professionalism should not be considered only a normative ideal. It needs to be seen as a counterweight to power. We cannot see it primarily as freedom from political and/or government intervention. As has been seen in East Central Europe as well as in the United States, we need also to think about freedom from commercial intervention. But even that is too limiting, it seems to me. The crucial elements, I think, are what people define themselves as journalists, to what degree they control the practice of journalism, both facts and opinions, and to what degree they adhere to certain ethical standards. They seek, insofar as legally and politically possible, to represent the public good. At least that's what the best journalists do. In East Central Europe, what historically the intelligentsia defined as the public good might not be the same as what the public would have wanted. But the goal is the same, still excellence, still trying to serve the general public. This more focused understanding of journalistic professionalism also allows us to address issues prominent in journalism today, and it gives us a better perspective historically on journalism in East Central and Eastern Europe. It also builds on what Wolfgang Donsbach 3 decades ago called legitimacy through competence. One might also ask, as Christopher Myers and colleagues do in a recent article, that instead of focusing on whether a person is a journalist, we should consider whether the work the journalist does, or that person does, satisfies the conditions that characterize legitimate journalism. Pam Shoemaker and Steve Reese have warned that the term professionalism must be used with caution. Journalism is a field with some, but not all, the attributes of a profession. Some even question, of course, if journalism is a profession at all. The answer depends on what set of criteria is used. Karl Manoff and Michael Schudson observed that journalism is, quote, a form of fiction operating out of its own conventions and understandings and within its own set of sociological, ideological, and literary constraints. They say ideology, that is, journalism ideology, organizational structure, and literary convention are important, while Shoemaker and Rees consider routines, organizational influences, and ideology. The ideology of journalism and literary convention might be the most important. And I say literary convention because in East Central Europe, there is this very faint line dividing journalists and writers, and sometimes people have crossed over it very easily. 3 Baltic scholars employ the useful view of journalism as a professionalizing occupation. According to their perspective, journalism is professional by its abstract nature and its ambitions to correspond to high professional standards. Dennis McQuail, one of the leading theoreticians in Western news media studies, says the core value of media professionalism is meeting public needs for information, or the right to know. Carla Nordenstreng points out that the international principles of journalists' organizations define professional journalism as supported by the idea of a free and responsible press, and calls for professional autonomy of journalists as well as a measure of public accountability. The first clause that Carla uses, I think, is the ideal. The second more closely approximates my thesis. My Indiana colleague Dave Weaver understands 3 basic journalistic roles for professionals: disseminator, interpreter, and adversary, where the professional is required to have a responsibility toward the public and to be a possible opponent of those in power. It is the adversary role that has been problematic in the American understanding of professional. In the rest of the presentation, I first want to spend time looking at how the idea of journalistic professionalism developed in the United States, and then compare that implicitly to how we have defined professionalism in East Central Europe at different times and different places. Until the last part of the 19th century, there were no uniform journalism standards of practice in the US. No barriers to entry, no quality control, and very little independent exercise of power. All factors that we normally have considered hallmarks of professionalism. Political parties did not control newspapers. Rather, journalists allied themselves with political parties and leaders and participated with them in the making of policy. In the newspapers, fact mixed with opinion. A major push toward nonpartisanship came from the progressive movement at the end of the 19th century, which, among other things, stressed that partisan politics should cease to be part of government, not just of media, and that professionals should be looked at as leaders. It was during this time that journalism education began to grow at the university level because progressivism and professionalism valued expertise. International organizations based in Europe followed similar goals of professional development at the end of the 19th century, or at least they enunciated them. This emphasis gained strength when a famous 20th century American journalist, Walter Lippmann, and others observed how influential propaganda had proved to be among ordinary people in World War I. Ironically, however, it was just at that time that journalism education in the United States began to teach its students not to draw conclusions, but rather just to quote both sides of an argument and assume the public would be paying attention enough to make a decision. Why hadn't they done that during the war? This new definition of professionalism met with the approval of newspaper owners because it was less likely to irritate readers, and thus they could maintain, if not increase, subscribers and profits. Journalists' desire for professional understanding and the economic circumstances of mass media thus worked together to strengthen the movement toward what we call objectivity. Journalists defined at the time a new role for themselves that liberated them not only from outside parties and advertisers, but even from the owners and publishers within the communication industry. Economic circumstances did not mandate objectivity, But as the number of newspapers decreased, publishers found it a competitive advantage to disavow partisanship and emphasize professionalism. They said if there's only one newspaper in a city and there's no competition, it doesn't matter because we are being objective and we are being professional. They could gain readers of almost every political outlook that way. In 1930, only one city out of 5 in the United States had competing newspapers. In contrast to most of Europe, American newspapers did not divide themselves by class. Only briefly in the 1920s did sensationalist tabloid newspapers arise to serve a working class audience, but at best they lasted about 3 decades. The term objectivity wasn't even widely used until the 1920s. Before that, terms such as unbiased were more common. The American ideal toward journalistic professionalism spread across Europe after World War II, propelled by the theory that it prevented the strong national and political feelings believed to have contributed to World War II. Many Westerners assumed after the fall of communism that these ideas, aided by Western know-how, would also move into East Central Europe. They saw East European journalism as the other, the opposite of Western journalism as it was, or as it should be. East European journalists knew that wouldn't happen. And it's interesting, we had a program at Indiana University for a number of years called the Foreign Journalists Program. And it was first set up at Northwestern University, designed to teach German journalists after World War II how to do journalism effectively the American way. And then it began to serve third world journalists. And then there was this awkward moment in 1960 or 1961 when a Polish journalist by the name of Wiesław Gornicki wanted to participate in the program. And there had to be some consultations whether Poland would be properly participating in a program for third world journalists. They changed the definition at the time and how they did things. In contrast to journalism in much of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the journalists of the Visegrad countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, drew extensively from a West European experience that is commercial as well as political. So too do the Baltic countries, but perhaps with a less developed civil society because of political circumstances in the interwar period. West European political leaders no longer see journalists, I think, as potential societal leaders, while both East Central leaders and journalists remember journalists of the past as leaders, and they're not quite certain about the present. Some of the East European leaders just kind of disdain, say nasty things about journalists that they are completely unworthy of respect. Most importantly, the development of the internet with its mix of facts, opinions, and fiction has challenged a journalistic profession that has been buffeted by ownership changes, economics, and politics. The local language press of East Central Europe was developed by nations that were part of multinational empires, usually in subordinate positions. Newspapers therefore helped create modern nations and also reflected their growth. They also developed as national political institutions devoted to fostering national goals in politics, economics, and culture. From the mid-19th to the early 20th century, the Czech and Slovak press helped create a sense of Czech and Slovak national identity, even as some of the newspapers became increasingly politicized. At the start of the 20th century, some of the parties began to support urban, sensationalist, non-political dailies. They were staffed by dozens of anonymous journalists who hunted for daily happenings and court reports and prepared them for press. They were news workers, really. In Hungary, the media were used in the 19th century to resurrect Hungarian national feeling and to help regain hegemony within the eastern half of the Habsburg Empire. Hungary offers the best evidence in pre-World War I East Central Europe of the way in which journalism overlapped with politics and literature. Many young Hungarian writers of the period made their living as newspaper journalists until they could make their mark and living as writers or politicians. As journalists, they could earn a living and reach the public. But as Hungarian journalist Isidor Kalnoky observed at the time, they did not fancy themselves as journalists. There is a moral and an immoral side to journalists, he said. The first is for information, and the second is for influencing the public. The first purpose is served by gray, nameless reporters, the other by great men and famous reporters. Young intellectuals on the make flooded Budapest, hoping they would not have to spend too much time in the mind-killing and ruthless profession of journalism. And it's rather interesting because, as you may know, a large part of the Hungarian press at the time that was supporting Hungarian nationalism and politics was owned and staffed by Jews. The 19th century Polish press became an important national institution during the partitions. Because none of the partitioned parts had a meaningful level of self-government or local autonomy for any significant period of time, the press became the major national institution and political forum in each part of Poland. According to Jane Leftwich Curry, this experience of the partition established many journalism traditions in Poland. These included the perception that journalists should be members of the intelligentsia who did not require professional schooling, that committed professional journalists could also work in other professions without leaving journalism, and that strong ties should exist between journalism and politics, a definition quite different from what was happening in the United States at the time. A significant commercial element, including a boulevard press, arose in various parts of East Central Europe before World War I. Like in Hungary, journalists on these papers and on some weeklies and monthlies worked as wage-earning employees with minimal attention to politics. In the interwar period, the press of the Visegrad countries experienced further commercial growth, furthered by the taste of national independence. Journalism was most important as a political force, but commercial functions grew increasingly important. Political allegiance prevailed as a journalistic and professional journalistic value over social responsibility. By far the most widely read Czech newspapers, for instance, were the entertaining and mostly non-political tabloid evening newspapers. The press was an inseparable part of Polish politics during the interwar period. Several large publishing companies did get established with modern equipment, and their publications tended to be non-political in outlook. But regional and social divisions in Poland were reflected in the slow development of the national press and in the development of a federal-style journalists' organization. A three-tier press developed in Poland: high-status, costly journals, middle-level political journals, and a money-making tabloid press in the cities. About Hungary, I only mentioned that interwar growth was subdued by the experience of revolution in 1919, followed by the authoritarian regime of Admiral Miklos Horthy. I'm not going to talk about World War II, just as I didn't talk about World War I, because it's a whole different set of issues that I don't have time to go into. While during the Stalinist days in East Central Europe, media operations in the various countries were similar, liberalization as early as 1953 started journalists and journalism onto many different roads that became clearer later. Journalists in East Central Europe began to define new roles for themselves. Some saw themselves as politicians, some as reporters, and some as writers. Jane Curry argues that Poland's journalists in the 1960s and 1970s became professionals by demanding for themselves the right of control over their own product, that is, what they were writing. They served as moderators between society and the country's leadership. They extended the agenda of public and private debate. They were able to do this, she writes, although they had to accept the rules of the game as defined by the regime, so that in that way they became partners of the regime. And you can begin to see how complicated things get in understanding what was going on. In 1980, they looked aghast at the upstart Solidarity journalists, who they thought lacked what it takes to become a true journalist. Stefan Bratkowski, who was thrown into the Solidarity maelstrom, mentioned to me in spring 1989 that, quote, "I am authorized by my personal opinion to write what I please," unquote. In doing so, he was condemning the slow development of professionalism that Curry found so positive. The declaration of martial law, actually in 1981, divided Polish journalists into three camps. One part, including many that styled themselves as liberals, supported the martial law regime, and even became part of it, perhaps seeing it as a lesser evil than a Soviet invasion. Most notable among this group was Mieczysław Rakowski, editor of Polityka, the weekly of the unofficial loyal opposition. Some of these journalists sought to regain credibility by emphasizing scrupulous adherence to an ethical code of conduct. A second group, best represented by Rakowski's fellow staffer, Andrzej Wróblewski, left the public arena for private work, or for public work as journalists on obscure publications, such as a publication for the blind. A third group, whose most visible representative was Bratkowski, went into opposition, where they helped to develop a lively second circle of underground publications that issued more than 1 million copies weekly. They emphasized freedom of speech, pluralism, the right to communicate, and the socialization of the media. This last group was the beneficiary of an influx of young people, not traditionally trained and socialized as journalists, who adopted an older, more combative tradition of journalism that stressed participation. Given the professional tradition of Polish journalism, which group was right? The answer may well be that they all were, that the split demonstrated the diversity and vitality of Polish journalism. In Curry's view, the Polish journalist had a job, not a vocation. The journalist, if not a politician, was at least a participant in the public arena. This explains why so many journalists, such as Tadeusz Mazowiecki and Rakowski, both prime ministers, and Jerzy Orban and Wiesław Gornicki, both government spokesmen, could accept political posts and still call themselves journalists. These differing views on what it meant to be a journalist confused the public. Polish audiences were skeptical about a code of ethical conduct adopted in 1983 by the Association of Journalists of the People's Republic of Poland. For me, it was personally interesting. I mentioned that foreign journalist project before. 3 Polish journalists went through the project. One of them was Gornicki, who became speechwriter and official spokesman for the president of Poland. Andrzej Wróblewski, I already mentioned in passing, he was in the middle. He worked for the publication for the blind. And Andrzej Krajewski served as a translator and interpreter for the Washington Post because he said there was no way he could do anything but be in opposition, and he wrote for the underground press as well. I was pleased just yesterday, by chance he saw my name on the program here and sent me an email reestablishing contact that had been broken for 25 years. In Hungary, journalists took credit for having an even greater impact on bringing about the end of communist rule. But there's a backstory. The defeat of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 was a major contributing factor. János Kádár, who came to power in November 1956, chose an inclusive style of ruling, best captured in the phrase, "He who is not against us is with us." The result, however, was not simply that Hungarian journalists learned to play along. As Thomas Setzko has explained, the Kádár regime often withheld important information from the population. The challenge to journalists was to include some of that information in their reports. In so doing, they learned the moves and tricks of the power game and the whereabouts of the escape doors that led out of tight situations. They knew there were a few topics that were off limits and that they could not ignore the sensitivities of both the Hungarian Communist Party and that of the USSR. But beyond that, they could explore a whole range of topics. When the Communist Party seized control of Czechoslovakia in 1948, most of the experienced non-communist journalists left the country or were forced out of their jobs. Over the next 2 decades, however, a number of the new journalists who flooded into the media gradually took up the role of societal representative, and this is evident if you look at the proceedings of the journalists' congresses that were held every 5 years. In the mid-1960s, Alexander Dubček allowed a more open journalism to prosper. When the Prague Spring was ended during the period from August 1968 to April 1969, journalists were blamed by the regime for its excesses. More than 1,000 journalists were banned. In the Czech lands, they were replaced by careerists. In Slovakia, far fewer journalists were removed, and they were allowed to express a culturally national agenda. But few journalists, Czech or Slovak, pushed a professional or a political agenda. Many remembered what had happened to their colleagues after 1968. Occasional reminders quieted the others. The silence of the journalists began to frustrate even the Communist Party in the 1980s as it sought to regain a measure of public trust and encourage journalists to address social issues. When communism collapsed in November 1989, all of its leading journalists in Czechoslovakia left the profession, although many others proved very willing and able to serve their new masters. They were joined by some journalists from 1968 who had been banned, but returned in 1989 to journalism, where, according to Andrei Shkolkai, their dogmatic, non-analytical, and outdated behavior had a negative effect on post-communist developments. When communism collapsed in East Central Europe in 1989, most journalists faced choices. Some of the leading communist journalists, particularly in Czechoslovakia, as I mentioned, were discredited. Many new, untrained reporters flooded into the system. Should journalists be professionals, political leaders, or entrepreneurs? Some journalists, particularly those who had not worked within the communist system, took a very political attitude toward the media, seeing the press and broadcasting as playing very important activist roles in the political system. Journalists who saw themselves as inheriting the traditional intellectual's role of societal leadership fell into this group. Other journalists pursued commercial aims, knowing from observing Western media that publishers of tabloids, sensationalist, and entertainment media could make large sums of money in the market. Jerzy Urban is actually a good example of that in Poland. A third group of journalists sought to retain the professional attitudes they had developed and to serve their readers and viewers. Hungarian researcher Ildikó Kovács has observed how in the political vacuum that followed the collapse of communism, journalists played the role of non-existent democratic institutions and were politically active in helping the changes. Setska suggested that in playing a much greater role in the overthrow of the old regime than did the media in neighboring countries, they constituted an ex-lex state. But when a new politically conservative regime, supported by only 15% of the journalists, came to power in the first elections, it quickly criticized the journalists for not serving the new elite. The journalists, in the name of freedom of opinion, continued to push their own political priorities, they complained. The differences of opinion led to a so-called media war over control of radio and television. The two sides fought over the presentation of news. The two sides stalemated over control of broadcasting and the implementation of a new broadcast law. The return of a more conservative government to power in 1998 again stalemated the media war, and even the International Federation of Journalists tried to get involved. The main non-politicized segment of the media in Hungary was represented by the tabloid newspapers. They featured international and domestic gossip. They eschewed politics in favor of escapism. They promoted a more global agenda and made domestic political news relatively unimportant. By definition, journalists working on these papers generally had to avoid political agendas. What counted most was the ability to sell a good story. Since Viktor Orban won a supermajority in 2010, opposition to his government has virtually disappeared from the media, with some distinguished journalists even moving abroad. As with many of their colleagues in Central and Eastern Europe, Polish journalists entered the post-communist period with mixed feelings. They welcomed the idea that censorship and political control would diminish, if not disappear. They anticipated a journalism that would serve the public, helping perhaps to give the public a voice, not only at the national, but also at the regional and local level, which they thought was lacking in some Western countries. Many journalists had some awareness of the operations of a capitalist media, of the drive for profits, but they thought that they could combine their professionalism with learning from the experience of others to produce a better system for Poland. They proved insufficiently aware of four problems. One was the continued desire of political parties and politicians to influence the media. The political struggle left very little social space for the functioning of a free public sphere. Both politics and journalism were Italianized. The Polish journalists were also unaware of the need to raise capital to modernize the media, the nature of competition, and their own ambivalence about impartiality. A 1994 survey by Jerzy Olensky, reported in a book on global journalists, suggests that Polish journalists at the time supported a journalistic professionalism that was not unlike that in the United States. But they were discouraged by the decline in the way the public valued journalists and thought they would need to resort to greater sensationalism to recover it. What the journalists said and how they acted began to diverge, which brings us back to a point that was raised earlier this afternoon in the previous plenary address. As Karl Jakubowicz noted, in many cases, journalists lack the skills to provide audiences with the information needed. They also reject calls to improve their professional skills. Their work tends to express mainly their own views and fails to articulate the needs, interests, and opinions of huge segments of society. Any criticism of their performance is rejected on the grounds that it infringes on the freedom of the press and on their own freedom of speech. In the eyes of the Polish public, the prestige of journalism was gradually diminishing. In surveys during communist times in 1975 and 1987, the journalists rated 71 on a scale of 100 for highly valued, 75 for valued, and so forth, not dissimilar from other occupations of the intelligentsia. But by 1995, it had declined to 67, and in 1996 to 64. Now it's in the 50s. There does seem to be some evidence that politicians and government officials in Poland believe benefits are to be gained from portraying journalists as independent and irresponsible. The Czech situation drew the most widespread attention at the beginning of this century. In January 2000, Czech media analyst Andrew Stroline strongly criticized the weaknesses of Czech journalists. Rarely, he wrote, do they ever engage in an investigative journalism. Their coverage of political news is simply who said what to whom. Part of the problem is that many Czech journalists learned their trade during the behave yourself communist years. Many who were journalists during the strictest period of normalization after the Prague Spring remained active. They justified their approach by saying that it was dangerous to make attacks when democracy was fragile. What do we have in 2012? A survey in the Czech Republic found that 70% of the journalists believed that the main negative impact on media quality was the low level of expertise among journalists. But 2/3 mentioned advertisers. Almost that many blamed senior editors, and 59% found media owners at fault. So both internal and external controls were very much in effect. Complicating matters throughout the region was the foreign ownership that flooded into East Central European media after 1989. They were interested in making a profit, not in becoming part of the political system. That meant that their journalists could keep their distance from domestic political and economic powers. But as newspapers have struggled financially, some of the foreign owners are beginning to withdraw, leaving the mass media even more at a disadvantage against governments and political parties. In Latvia, the lack of journalistic solidarity, including no common code of ethics, combined with the disappearance of foreign ownership, has had a particularly negative effect. A fundamental change is taking place in the nature of the journalist in East Central and Eastern Europe. One of the roles of the past, the propagandist, failed rapidly because it was dysfunctional in the modern world, as evidenced by the experience of late communism when media audiences could see the disconnect between actual reality and the reality portrayed in the media. Since the end of Stalinism, journalists in East Central and Eastern Europe have been at varying times both professionals and members of the intelligentsia. As professionals, they sought to be objective and as impartial as they could, people who could mediate on behalf of societal interests. As intelligentsia, journalists were societal leaders who were expected to use their greater knowledge and experience to advance the people whose unelected leaders they were. In systems of restricted politics, such as colonial or authoritarian rule, this was in the end positive. It was politics in the press, a democracy of the pen. In a more democratic society, general knowledge should be more widespread, and detailed knowledge should be the province of specialists. In this kind of situation, the intellectual leadership of journalists tends to be less and less justified, particularly unjustified in view of what opposition intellectuals were advocating in the late communist period: freedom of speech and the right of all people to communicate. Journalists, like other citizens, wanted to participate in the creation of a post-communist society, but in such a democracy, no special privileges adhere to their position. Some of the intelligentsia would argue, however, that the demands of a commercial media, in particular the need to satisfy the readers, listeners, surfers, or viewers, when combined with the professional approach, will diminish in the media the important role of providing the information people need to make informed voting decisions. We see this happening around the world. But the intelligentsia are no longer society's sole defense. Far from it. Commercialism is not the issue, I think, either. Governments and political parties prefer to limit debate on all issues. The printed word or the television screen needs to carry more than just news and information, as even communist systems discovered in the 1960s. So some of the entertainment and the sensationalism is necessary to bring in readers and viewers. If the intelligentsia are still justified in retaining their role as the conscience of the public, the explanation would be the lack of a developed party structure in the post-communist countries and the increasing failure of the news media to provide a sufficient amount of serious news and information. So where does that leave us? The challenge, I think, is whether journalists and members of the intelligentsia in East Central Europe and Eastern Europe can provide the range of information and variety of opinions on the basis of which people in a democratic society can make their wishes known. Perhaps the views of the intelligentsia, maybe not working as professional journalists, those views, especially on the internet, views which can be propelled along by social media, offer a solution in East Central Europe and Eastern Europe to the journalism crisis. And that's a solution that I don't see so much as available in the United States, where our public intellectuals do not carry the clout that the intelligentsia do here. We've heard some discussion about social media, and it seems to me to bring back the importance of professionalism among journalists and writers, the internet and the social media of passing those points of view along or providing links may be the ultimate outcome. Thank you.
I could add something, because once again you mentioned Professor Leonidas Donskis. It's again a beautiful parallel, very close friend of ours, very loyal professor at our university. So many more links, and he's public intellectual. He is also a person who speaks, assesses, reassesses our closest surrounding realities, and he writes really, really actively and energetically. I liked your conclusions were indeed in many ways resembling what we are actually thinking about here. Paolo, please, and then Zlinka. Oh, Zlinka was first.
Yeah, you were first.
Yes, please.
I saw you.
It's like a television game show where whoever gets the button first.
Thanks. I liked very much your presentation. You stole my punchline from tomorrow's presentation, because I also employed phases of analysis. I think it's extremely important to go back in history and to separate the phases of modernization, communism, or socialism, and post. And I also like your post-communism, because I also realized in my analysis of the Southeastern European region that we must somehow separate the 90s from what is happening after 2000. And perhaps there it wouldn't be post, but for some countries would be only starting transition in 2000. But the post-89 is not a solid kind of timeline, because it has a different And maybe in Visegrad countries it has a smoother line of development, but in Southeastern Europe there is clearly, around 2000, there's clearly a change in the regimes, some more drastic, some less drastic, but so I like very much your separation of the post-communist in two phases, so to speak. So this resonates very much with my research. So hopefully I will have something to say tomorrow.
Thank you for the comments. I would add that, again, one of the tricky things in doing an overview is I left out the bumps. So Slovakia under Vladimir Mečiar was struggling, and then it was better for a while, and now things aren't so good. And there's the famous Czech movement in the late 1990s by young people saying, "Thank you, now go," to basically tell some people that their time had passed.
Yeah, I like your presentation, but in a way it seems to me that you are underestimating the dramatic change that journalism, both in the United States but also in Europe, is going through these days. You didn't say anything about Fox News, for instance. You didn't say anything about Radio Talk United States and how it goes against the traditional dominant model of neutral journalism. And also you mentioned several times internet, but in terms of internet, are we still able to talk about professional journalism? I think that journalism today is a very blurred profession, in which you have on some part the old traditional professional journalists, but then you have bloggers. And for instance, if you take the example of a Boston Marathon and the news that they were spread by blogs, and the suicide committed by the young man who was on the picture of some blogs, and it was not part of a bombing at all. It was a picture that was moved by social networks and taken by newspapers, and so it's a blurred situation. How would you judge this?
I'm glad you mentioned this, because in effect, in the earlier part, I was talking about American journalism into the 50s and 60s and 70s, and I didn't come back and pick it up. What I was trying to say implicitly in the conclusion was that journalism in many parts of the world, there are again some exceptions like in India, journalism is struggling, circulations are going down. We have had this, what I would call a return to opinion journalism in the United States, since it was very much a part of our history, which many of our journalists, even some of those, unfortunately, who have taken my journalism history course, seem to have forgotten. But my point was that, or the argument was that we shouldn't necessarily look at whether a person is a journalist, but is the quality of the work that he or she does equal to what a journalist does. For a lot of bloggers, it's not. For a lot of Twitterites, if I can use that term, they just make their statement and go without worrying about it. Fortunately, many of our newspapers still have a gatekeeping function, and there was, during the Boston story, unfortunately, the Associated Press issued one piece of information falsely, which was then sent by social media very rapidly around, but the AP retracted it in something like 5 minutes. I think the real problem, as far as the pool of information, is that most people writing on the internet draw their original information from what we can call the legacy media or the traditional media. And as those fail, then the sources of information get more disparate. I mean, I could find somebody who knows something about, and people who write good quality blogs about nuclear power, about media, and I can go to those, but it takes a lot more work than looking at the traditional media. So, and I like the line about that you said about underestimating change, because I think we do forget, those of us who read newspapers back in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly in this part of the world. I mean, you know, it was black and white, or red and white, as some people would have said. But it was very uninteresting, at least some of it. But the fascinating thing during this period, I mean, we know that a newspaper like Literaturная Gazeta in the late 1980s was selling used copies for more than the original price. But even in the 70s and 80s in various parts of Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, there was a hunger for the press. So as black as it was, people still searched out information. And now with all of those sources of information, many people have lost that ability, or the new generation. Yeah.
One last comment that we have to round up.
Just going off of this idea, and you're talking about the different experts, do you think that this has something to do with the 24-hour cycle as well? Because it used to be the newspaper would have to be printed, and you would get it in the morning, or even with the nightly news, you would get that day's events, and that was it. But now you get news as it happens from the Twitterverse, from these places, and you've got a 24-hour news cycle to fill. You've got to constantly be filling a presence. And do you think that affects the quote-unquote professionalism?
I think it does, and it's interesting. That's another thing that did not used to be a value. It was really only with the arrival of the telegraph in the middle of the 19th century that became a value. And I mean, I'm not sure that I can do anything to stop it, but I think that perhaps we ought to rethink the idea that absolutely timeliness is a value, because so much of that first draft is so wrong. If we waited an hour, now I wasn't in the US when the Boston story happened, but my understanding is that NBC News and MSNBC did the best job, and it was often because they waited until they could confirm information. So yeah, some of this inaccuracy is driven by the 24/7 cycle, and I wish we could do something to stop that.
Okay, thank you very much.